Can you imagine living in a place where your rights are limited and your freedom is an illusion? Discover the truth behind the oppression faced by women in Saudi Arabia. Get ready for an eye-opening journey that will open your eyes to shocking realities and life-changing decisions forever. Obligations in Saudi Arabia: 7 weird things that only exist in this country. Number 1. Can you imagine living in a place where your rights are limited and your freedom is an illusion? Discover the truth behind the oppression faced by women in Saudi Arabia. Get ready for an eye-opening journey that will reveal shocking realities and life-changing decisions forever. The ban on magic in Saudi Arabia is an extreme manifestation of the rigorous religious interpretation that dominates the country. Since 2009, a specialized group has been tasked with combating this practice, deemed an affront to fundamental Islamic beliefs. This measure reflects not only a rejection of the supernatural, but also an attempt to consolidate religious power over society by imposing strict norms that limit any form of expression, challenging established authority. Saudi Arabia's approach to magic is not just a matter of religious doctrine, but also of social control. The belief that magic represents a form of spiritual and moral deviation has led to the enforcement of severe laws against those who practice or even promote such acts. This repression targets not only individuals, but also entire communities associated with practices considered heretical or dangerous to social cohesion. The ban on magic can also be seen as a tool to maintain cultural and religious homogeneity within the Saudi kingdom. By suppressing any form of magic or esotericism, the government aims to prevent the influence of ideas deemed foreign or antithetical to the conservative Islamic values that underpin the country's social and political structure. This measure seeks not only to suppress individual practices, but also to protect a particular vision of Islam considered the moral and spiritual foundation of the nation. In addition to religious and cultural motivations, the ban on magic in Saudi Arabia can also be interpreted as an attempt to maintain control over narratives and forms of power within the kingdom. By limiting the practice of magic, it reinforces the monopoly of the state and religious authorities over what is deemed acceptable in terms of spiritual practices and rituals. This repression affects not only direct practitioners of magic, but also sends a clear message about the limits of dissent and personal autonomy in a deeply conservative and controlled context. In summary, the ban on magic in Saudi Arabia reflects the rigorous enforcement of religious and cultural norms designed to preserve a specific national and religious identity. This measure not only seeks to reinforce control over spiritual practices, but also to maintain social and political cohesion, reflecting a particular vision of Islam and its moral precepts. Number 2. The extreme water scarcity in Saudi Arabia represents a painful paradox for a country proud of its oil wealth. As the country grapples with the reality that water is more expensive than oil itself, it exposes relentless neglect towards the basic needs of its population. The low availability of drinking water and the high costs associated with desalination reflect a ruthless prioritization of profit over human welfare, leaving millions of citizens in a perpetual state of vulnerability and extreme dependence. Instead of effectively addressing water management, Saudi elites choose to protect and expand their personal and national wealth at the expense of their own citizens' suffering. This scarcity is not just an ecological tragedy, but also a testimony to the cruelty of a system perpetuating inequality and deprivation through policies and practices favoring the powerful while condemning the poor to a life of hardship and deprivation. The water scarcity in Saudi Arabia is not merely an environmental crisis, but a moral and political crisis revealing the true nature of a regime prioritizing economic gain over life itself. This situation reflects a calculated indifference to the human consequences of political and economic decisions, where the thirst for power and wealth, by a few, translates into desperation and suffering for many. In summary, water scarcity in Saudi Arabia is not just a technical or economic issue, but a brutal testimony to the lack of humanity and responsibility among those with the power and influence to make a significant difference. As the country continues to face this crisis, Its leaders display a ruthless insensitivity towards the basic needs of their own people, perpetuating a cycle of desperation and inequality threatening the nation's stability and dignity. Number 3. The omnipresent influence of Islam in everyday life in Saudi Arabia is a manifestation of absolute control over the identity and actions of its citizens. The mandatory 5 daily prayers not only reflect spiritual devotion, but also a mechanism of social control permeating every aspect of Saudis' lives. This rigidity imposed by Islamic law not only dictates religious rituals, but also rigorously regulates public and private morality, imposing standards of decency, severely limiting individual freedom and personal expression. The combination of religion and culture in Saudi Arabia creates an environment where conformity to Islamic norms is non-negotiable, leaving little room for diversity of thought and expression. This imposed homogeneity not only stifles creativity and innovation, but also perpetuates a value system that can be restrictive and alienating for those seeking a more free and authentic life. Moreover, the strictness of these norms not only affects citizens' daily lives, but also extends to the country's public and political sphere. The intersection of religion and government in Saudi Arabia reinforces an authoritarian system that uses faith as a tool to maintain order and obedience, often at the expense of individual rights and social justice. In conclusion, the imposition of Islamic law in Saudi daily life not only shapes religious practices, but also configures a social and political environment where personal liberty and cultural diversity are sacrificed for imposed uniformity. This totalitarian control over religion and culture defines the Saudi experience in a way that deeply limits possibilities for expression and authentic human development. Number 4. The strict prohibition of gambling in Saudi Arabia reflects relentless control over the recreational and economic activities of its citizens. This policy not only imposes severe legal and social restrictions, but also underscores a value system that prioritizes Islamic morality over individual autonomy and personal freedoms. Under this prohibition, any form of participation in gambling carries serious legal and social consequences, including penalties ranging from significant fines to corporal punishments such as public flogging, in line with a rigorous interpretation of Islamic law. This prohibition not only reinforces a climate of surveillance and control over citizens' private activities, but also perpetuates a black market and underground gambling scene, where illegal activity thrives despite severe legal consequences. The use of VPNs to access online gambling sites is just one example of how individuals seek to circumvent imposed restrictions, risking serious punishments in an effort to satisfy recreational or economic needs officially prohibited. Furthermore, the prohibition of gambling not only impacts individual citizens, but also has broader economic implications for the country. The absence of a legal gambling industry limits opportunities for investment and economic development in a sector that, in other contexts, could generate significant revenue and employment. This restriction also perpetuates economic dependence on the oil sector and other state-controlled industries, limiting economic diversification and opportunities for sustainable growth. In summary, the strict prohibition of gambling in Saudi Arabia represents not only a limitation of individual freedoms, but also a reflection of authoritarian control over recreational and economic activities of its citizens. This policy not only imposes severe legal and social restrictions, but also perpetuates an underground market and economic dependence on the state, undermining opportunities for diversification and economic growth. Number 5. After decades of prohibition, the reintroduction of cinemas in Saudi Arabia in 2018 marked a significant shift in the kingdom's cultural policy, primarily driven by Vision 2030. This ambitious modernization project, led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, aimed to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy and open the country to new forms of entertainment and recreation. The reintroduction of cinemas not only represented a cultural advancement in terms of cultural offerings for Saudi citizens, but was also seen as an attempt by the government to improve the kingdom's international image, promoting an image of openness and modernization. However, this cultural openness was not without controversies and restrictions. Despite the reintroduction of cinemas, films shown in Saudi Arabia are subject to strict censorship, with cuts and edits imposed to comply with the kingdom's social and religious norms. This has sparked criticism both domestically and internationally, as it limits artistic freedom and cultural diversity by adapting films to local sensitivities. Moreover, the reintroduction of cinemas has been viewed by some critics as a superficial attempt at modernization that does not address deeper issues of human rights and individual freedoms in the kingdom. Despite initial growth in cinema openings and film screenings, restrictions remain a significant barrier to the development of a dynamic and creative film industry in Saudi Arabia. In conclusion, the reintroduction of cinemas in Saudi Arabia in 2018 as part of Vision 2030 represented a significant cultural advancement, but was also accompanied by restrictions and criticisms. This step towards cultural modernization reflects government efforts to diversify the economy and improve the kingdom's international image, though it continues to face challenges related to censorship and limitations on artistic freedom. Number 6. In Saudi Arabia, separate weddings for men and women reflect a deeply entrenched system rooted in Islamic traditions that perpetuates segregation and gender inequality. This discriminatory practice not only divides communities based on gender, but also reinforces archaic stereotypes about the inability of men and women to interact socially without supervision. Segregated weddings are not only a manifestation of institutionalized misogyny, but also perpetuate a culture of control over the autonomy and freedom of women, reducing them to mere objects of male protection and surveillance. This systematic segregation during weddings imposes severe restrictions on women, limiting their participation in significant social events and perpetuating a patriarchal structure that places them in a subordinate role. These practices not only reflect deeply rooted gender inequality, but also perpetuate restrictive norms that deny women the opportunity to fully enjoy their basic human rights and participate equitably in public life. Furthermore, separate weddings contribute to the marginalization of women in both public and private spheres, perpetuating an unfair division that reflects a legal and social system relegating women to second-class citizenship. This segregation is not only a manifestation of structural discrimination, but also serves as a constant reminder of the barriers imposed on women in their pursuit of equality and dignity in Saudi society. In summary, separate weddings in Saudi Arabia are not only a blatant manifestation of gender inequality, but also reflect a deeply rooted patriarchal system that perpetuates discrimination and subordination of women. These discriminatory practices must be challenged and questioned as part of a broader movement towards equality and respect for universal human rights in the Saudi kingdom. Number 7. In the camel market of Riyadh, a culture is perpetuated that not only values these animals for their utility as means of transportation, but also exploits them for their derived products, such as meat, milk, and wool, without consideration for animal welfare or ethical trading practices. This market, being the largest of its kind in the world, symbolizes an economy prioritizing economic profit over ethical treatment of animals, relegating them to mere commercial products rather than living beings with rights and intrinsic needs. The massive commercialization of camels in Riyadh reflects a ruthless mindset that uses these animals as mere tools for profit, disregarding their physical, emotional, or psychological well-being. This insensitive practice perpetuates a cycle of animal exploitation that undermines any ethical consideration for fair and humane treatment, contributing to a culture of indifference towards animal suffering in the name of economic gain. Furthermore, the Riyadh camel market symbolizes an industry based on the exploitation of natural resources without sustainable management or proper environmental ethics. The exclusive focus on production and commercialization of camel-derived products ignores broader implications for species conservation and ecological impact of such unchecked commercial practices. Reflecting on life in Saudi Arabia, we confront a world of contrasts and challenges where the struggle for equality and freedom remains a daily battle. What future awaits those who challenge these deeply entrenched norms?